Hi, welcome. Our talk was interrupted by our fire slash not fire alarm, and we had a few people that left that didn't get to see the end of it, and we decided that we would make a voice recording with our screen share. If you didn't get a chance to see it, and this is your first time, welcome. We are talking about digital arts mashup. This talk was presented at 3 o'clock on Friday at the NAEA 2019. And I am Meredith Cosier. I currently teach kindergarten through sixth grade art and STEAM in Northern Virginia.
And I'm Luke Meeken. I'm currently a first year PhD candidate in art education at Penn State. But before that, I spent the last 4 years teaching new media art ed in a public high school in Virginia. So we're going to share our projects and our experiences from the last 5 years of this digital arts mashup camp.
So, Digital Arts Mashup was a camp that we taught at the Smithsonian for the last 5 years, which means we spent 10 6-hour days in a windowless computer lab with middle schoolers using a eclectic variety of digital tools.
Since this was a camp and not a traditional classroom, we had a lot of flexibility compared to our normal school year job, right? This was not assessed. It was collaborative learning. We didn't have our normal scheduling concerns. We had the kids all day through the whole week, Monday through Friday, and sometimes 2 weeks some years. We've been able to, in this context, experience teaching technology with a flexible, dialogic, student-led approach. But this presentation isn't just about this sort of idealized circumstance, right? We've been able to bring elements of this practice back into our K through 12 experience, and we're going to talk about that in the back half at the end of our talk. So before we go into things, I wanted to talk a bit about the ethos of the camp. It comes in part from these two contemporary media theorists. One is Olya Lina. She's a media theorist, a net artist, and an educator. And she has this concept called the general purpose user, which she uses to describe someone who's empowered to achieve their creative goals regardless of the primary purpose of the software. So she would describe it as someone who can lay out their business cards in an Excel spreadsheet or shave their face using their webcam or something like that, right? It's not about we want in that same sense we want our kids to have a kind of pragmatic eclecticism where they can go home and make art on their parents' computer in MS Paint or in PowerPoint, rather than teaching them the quote-unquote right industry standard ways of working with Photoshop or some Adobe program. In short, we want to teach kids creative skills and possibilities, not just tell them prescriptive ways how to use software. Another inspiration is media theorist Douglas Rushkoff, specifically his book Program or Be Programmed. One idea he kind of hits on in there is that whereas with, say, drawing, a child or an adult can look at a drawing and sort of understand, oh, I could pick up a pencil, make my own drawing in my own way. Digital systems don't really present themselves as human-made in the same way, and it's not as common for a person, a child or an adult, to look at a digital system and realize, oh, I can make that because that was made by a person. So we want to teach kids that they can shape digital culture. One other sort of illustration of this ethos that I found at the Whitney Museum in New York, it's hanging there right now, is this textile piece by new media artist Joan Truckenbrode called Curvilinear Perspective. She made it in 1979, and it really illustrates this sort of scrappy ethos of digital arts mashup. Because in order to make this textile, back in 1979, there weren't techniques for printing on textiles the way there are now. There weren't built-in hardware or software to do this sort of thing. So what she did was she wrote a custom program using BASIC, a very old programming language. It would generate images on a screen, and she picked up that screen, put it face down on a color copier, and then put heat transfer paper in the copier and literally made color copies of her screen on 8.5 by 11 sheets of heat transfer paper that she then ironed onto that cloth. So she didn't, in pursuing this, right, ask, what program do I use to put my image on cloth? She had a creative goal, and then she had to kind of figure out how she could reach that goal using the material she had at hand. And that's the sort of scrappiness we want our kids to have by the end of the camp.
And these experiences really fostered a growth mindset for both the students and us as the teachers. A person with a growth mindset assumes that their intelligence and other abilities can be developed, that you are not stuck at a certain skill set or a certain level. We often, as the teachers, had no idea how some of these projects were going to work or if they were going to work out. I am no expert, and neither is Luke. All of our knowledge in code, design, and 3D modeling came from problem solving with these kids and playing with the technologies within a self-education. The projects that we are going to share seem intimidating. Seem intimidating. If you see something that you want to try with your kids, but are thinking, oh, I can't do that. I don't know how that works. Add a yet to the end of your sentence. I can't do that yet. This doesn't make sense yet. And recognize that apprehension and self-doubt kills curiosity. That's not a child issue. That's a human reality for all of us. And then you start with the basics. We went old school and used Microsoft Paint. It seems antiquated to use a software that hasn't been developed in or altered in 10 years and is no longer supported, but is still available on every Windows computer. MS Paint is a powerful way to introduce universal computer design tools to children without all the complications that come with things like Photoshop. We had students using shape, drawing, text tools, and layout design to create their own personal logos, and then introduced more advanced tools with collaborative games. So what you're seeing here is a digital version of the surrealist game Exquisite Corpse. We gave our students a template, a paper-sized template that was split into 3 sections and had each student create a layer before they hid them to switch computers and work on somebody else's midsection or bottom section. This really pushed our ability to work with importing photos, transforming, erasing, painting, and working with layers in a non-destructive sense where we're not taking everything away. Another way that we played to learn was creating digital food portraits inspired by the 16th century painter Giuseppe Arcimboldo. Each portrait was required to have at least 20 layers, but we left the food choices optional and open. When it was available in our lab at the Smithsonian, we were using Photoshop 3, so still at least a decade back. But our backup has always been Pixlr.com's editor. It is an online version of Photoshop that is available to anyone with an internet connection and does not require a login to use their editor. The next phase was creating interactive art. We used GameMaker, which is a video game software, to do this, but you could also do this in Scratch or many other block programming programs. We had our students create a alternative self-portrait, including some part of their body or their face, and then images that supported or represented who they were. The objects that were added were blocks, which when you were a viewer were invisible to you, but they were placed there in the programming with a simple sequence called if mouse pressed left click, then play sound. In block coding, you're not typing. You are dragging preset pieces of code together to make a line of command. So with mouse pressed, it means that people were able to click around the image or the screen, and the work would speak back to them. We had students that were downloading sounds or recording their own, and some that were just doing excerpts of music. So you were able to click around and the image would start to make music with your interactivity. The next part was using physical computing. And we explored physical interaction design with Makey. A Makey is a pre-programmed circuit board that plugs into a computer, and the computer thinks it is a normal computer keyboard. So with up, down, left, right, arrow space, letter keys, any conductive material attached to the Makey with alligator clips could turn into a button. When we were doing our early years with the Makey, we mostly focused on students creating a alternative video game controller like the one that you see on the left. But last year, after NAEA 2018, I saw a really moving exhibit on the design and crafting of prosthetics called Bespoke Bodies in Portland, Oregon. And then I found out the Smithsonian's Design Museum in New York City has a collection of resources that they call Design Access, in tangent with their collection of over 70 works called Access Plus Ability that has been displayed not only at their museum but in locations around the world. Now, as much as I want to take a bunch of middle schoolers out of DC, we couldn't. So I created a digital field trip that allowed us to examine design intended to leverage human needs. We discussed the physical adaptability and the adaptive usability of computers for those that have needs that may be different from ourselves. The students created physical prototypes of their adaptive controls, the one that based around someone's specific need. So the one that you are seeing on the right is made for somebody with limited grasp, perhaps limited grip, or fewer fingers than average, and also for those that have upper limb difference. So someone that may not have a hand or a lower arm. And this design was intended to allow them to search the internet and scroll through pages without the cumbersome use of a computer mouse or small computer keys. As with most of our projects, the impact was centered on the design and the thought process behind that rather than a polished, finished project.
So another thing we wanted to do was introduce coding to the students after doing the block coding before. We wanted to move students from using software to making their own software. Again, reinforcing the idea that these students are creators of digital artifacts, creators of digital culture. Pictured here are some of the mischievous painting programs, one of the introductory activities we did with code. Students developed these using a free coding tool called Processing. Processing works for Windows and Macintosh. It can be downloaded from processing.org. And it's designed for students and artists, people who are new to programming, to be able to use and pick up pretty comfortably. In this project, the students and us, we talked about the design decisions that were embedded in the different art making tools we've been using, like Photoshop or MS Paint. What were those designers' expectations about how we'd want to use those programs or what we'd want to make with those programs? And then we challenged these young artists to create their own tools that have their own embedded design choices that someone else could then use to make artwork. Where the mischievous part comes in is we ask the students to include something that was unpredictable or random or surprising in their project, so that someone who is making art with this art tool might be surprised by what gets produced. One of the challenges in this process for the students was that we required them to independently explore the processing website. Processing has a reference base that has all the different commands processing has, and there are hundreds of commands, significantly more than we covered in the brief tutorial we did with the students, and they were challenged to independently research and implement something that we hadn't directly taught them. As a result of one of these areas of interest that seemed to come up in a lot of students' explorations, we eventually sort of built that out into a whole nother project, which was making sound responsive imagery. This gave students a chance to play with a new mode of interaction, which was sound, and create images that would respond to the volume of the microphone. And you'll see an example of a student playing with their project right now. So this project did result in our tiny windowless computer lab being filled with screaming middle schoolers for an entire afternoon. So consider yourself warned if you choose to implement this particular project. Um, Going on from this, right, we wanted to continue with this theme of coding and recoding digital systems. So we engaged in a creative practice called data bending, where you take the underlying code or data of certain files on the computer and transform them in sometimes unpredictable and experimental ways. So we taught the students how to access the code behind digital images, opening them up in a text editor and examining how ultimately all files, whether they're a JPEG image or an MP3 sound, are essentially made of data. They're made of code, and the computer doesn't look at them as an image or a sound, just as streams of data that we can manipulate and transform. So we use this knowledge to trick the computer, right, into opening up an image as a sound in this free sound editing program called Audacity. So we were able to open up a image file in the sound program and then apply certain transformations from the sound program, like let's make the image have an echo. Let's reverse part of the image. What happens if we make the image louder or quieter? And then we could save that result and then view the resulting file in a traditional image editing program and see what had happened. And the images would be transformed in sometimes unpredictable, chaotic, and occasionally very beautiful ways. And because it was easy to generate images quickly, and especially easy to generate a lot of junk quickly, the project went from a creation project to a curation project, where students would, sight unseen, perform a number of transformations using the sound program, experimenting with the different settings and filters and adjustments. And then after they had filled a whole folder with all these different images, they could reflect on the images they generated and select the ones that were the most interesting to print out or to animate.
And it's worth noting that there are other ways you can create glitch art. Luke found this way through a series of researching ways to work with data bending and transforming an image, or what would you say, taking an image
Into the sound editing program.
into the sound editing
yeah.
program, and forcing it to open up as other file extensions. Um, but it's not the only way you can do this. We included in our resource packet another way that you can work with glitch images, and there are certainly other ways. It's important to remind you that we were not trained on how to do anything in particular or anything with this. That Google is truly going to be your best friend when you're trying to teach new media. There may be a proper way to do something, an industry standard way to do something, but by the time your kids graduate high school or certainly by the time they graduate college if they choose to go, there will be a new way to do it. So just figure out whatever works for you, whatever works for your kids. And, Luke and I have been doing this for years where we pick ideas or student interests and we find the resources to teach ourselves how to do it, in turn, eventually teaching the students. That is truly the power of Yet for Teachers in Action, that you don't need to have the answers right now, just the willingness to look at possibilities. For instance, in 2014, we didn't know anything about 3D modeling. So like when we used our Microsoft Paint, we went old school again and we did papercraft. We used a lot of the digital art skills that we had been teaching the students. We started to teach them how to take sample imagery and turn it into offset patterns that could be applied to templates we downloaded from the internet. So what you're seeing on the right is an unfolded dodecahedron, which is also known as a 20-sided die. And each face is a equilateral triangle. These templates we simply just found by searching papercraft. But if the students really enjoyed putting them together. A papercraft is an early study of taking a 2D flat form and folding it to create a relatively seamless object. Now, we had kids, as an extra digital arts add-on, put LED lights inside of their paper crafts, and they really got so into folding it, we knew we had to go bigger. We had to find something else to do with this. And so we found an artist named Stephen Wintercroft. He's based in the UK. And he creates a lot of these low poly masks or coverings for the face. And I believe he has over 40. Our hypothesis is that he has developed a software where he can build three-dimensional forms, and the software unfolds the forms into 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper that can then be cut out and folded. But we purchased a couple of packages and gave the students options. We took them around the Natural History Museum and we went on a photo hunt. We were looking for textures or patterns found throughout the museum. So while everybody else is looking at the exhibits as a whole, our kids were trying to kind of push past to take a zoomed in picture of coral or a zoomed in picture of the floor, or when, for instance, we went into some of the best nature photography photos of some of the most professional photographers around the world, and they were taking little tiny portions of those photos. They then created offset patterns. So the saber-toothed tiger that you're seeing on the right was a student photo taken at the Gem and Minerals Permanent Collection of the Natural History Museum. And then they wrapped it around the mask and built them. These were printed on 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper, and some of the students really just got so into it they wanted to print them off on colored cardstock and just build them for fun. When it came to adding digital 3D modeling, in 2014, the Lego movie had come out, and as part of their promotion, Lego partnered with Google to create an international world of Lego builds. These were applied to an international map, and they were permanent in the sense that once you built it, you couldn't edit it. The world is still viewable, but the promotion ended in 2016, 2 years after the Lego movie came out. And Google reserved the only right to remove them. We could not even remove them if we wanted to. But we noticed in our physical location from the Natural History Museum, the National Gallery Sculpture Garden, which is next door, was completely empty. So we decided to take kids to the real sculpture garden. And then after they had a chance to observe and look at the design and functionality or form of those sculptures, they came back to the lab and had to create a digital version of sculptures that existed, but then also create their own model of a sculpture they felt should exist in the garden. And in this, we had a chance to really create the a moment of like what this sculpture garden could be down the line in the future. And of course, you know, in 2015, since we had done the sculpture garden to the left of us, we ended up doing the American History Museum to the right of us because we couldn't just do the sculpture garden again. It was permanent from the 2014 camp. Even though the promotion has ended, if you get a chance to go on the Lego Build with Chrome, you can still explore the international world. And if you zoom in to where the sculpture garden or the American history are on the National Mall, you can see our student sculptures still there. In looking for other three-dimensional or 3D modeling ways to bring to our students that were easily accessible, we found SculptGL. It is a online program. There's no logins, there's no ads, and the software itself mimics clay. So it starts you off with a sphere, and you have a variety of tools that will allow you to pull or inflate or carve and twist clay as if it were in your hands. The Pokemon Go application had been taking over the world. So we had students start by creating some animal forms that were very similar to creepy versions of Pokemon. The you can paint the 3D models in SculptGL, although a lot of the students found with the gray background the colors kind of limiting, and they did have almost a dull sense to them. But the project itself was so successful that we decided we needed to go bigger. So we took our kids to the botanical gardens. The U.S. Botanical Gardens are near the state capitol on the National Mall. And they host a large collection of exotic plants from all over the world. And so we went on this research expedition to see these plants, to think about the forms that these plants have, and then we came back to the lab to create our own. At this stage, even though we were working with 3D modeling, we had made the decision not to try to print them, and that what we were really focusing on was how to use the tools. We did show the kids how to document it by making screenshots, but for the most part, they were just staying on the computers. Another museum we had a chance to look at, the Smithsonian American History Museum, which is on the opposite side of natural history, has a lot of permanent collections, one of them being America on the Move. It is a permanent exhibition that looks at the development of transportation across the entire 20th century. If you ever get a chance to go there, don't skip the American History Museum. It's a lot more forward-thinking than it sounds. But we took kids there and challenged them to come up with a personal transport vehicle. Now, we built these in Tinkercad. Tinkercad not only has a free online software, we, in fact, had students using bogus emails. So you can make emails that aren't real as the logins, as long as you write down the password so you don't forget them. But the students in this challenge made things, for instance, the flight bike, which is a bike that both flies and rides on the ground, a personal dolphin submarine, and my favorite, the egg pod spaceship. So we had a lot of fun with this. We then found other ways to extend on Tinkercad that Luke is going to tell you about.
All right. So what we've shown you so far are the things we did during the first year or two that we ran the camp. We were trying out new things, but we were also staying a bit in our comfort zone by repurposing familiar software like Photoshop and Game Maker, albeit to new ends. But what's been really most exciting about this camp is how the student-centered, dialogic nature of it has over the years pushed us so far outside of our comfort zones and into learning new things that we'd never done before in our own artistic practice, right? By responding affirmatively to students' questions and interests, we were able to expand the range of experiences we were providing the students and also expand our own personal artistic experiences. So on the screen, we're going to show just like a brief sort of map of how one simple project, the Lego sculpture garden, literally just snapping together colored blocks, ballooned and spread into really interesting and strange new places for us. So as K.C. already talked about, a couple of extensions from this sculpture garden project were the plant forms and the animal forms that we made in SculptGL. Another project that grew out of that was a Tinkercad project where the students were making putt-putt courses for a prospective installation on the National Mall that was under construction. And after these, students usually had some questions like, we went to the botanical garden, we made these beautiful plants. Why does each of our projects, each of our plants just has to live separately on our own computer? Can't we put them all together in a garden like the one we were just at? Which meant that Casey and I had to figure out how can we create an environment that combines all of these things into a virtual botanical garden. We wound up figuring out how to implement this, make it work, and it became a project, right? Students, after we made the putt-putt courses, asked the logical question, why can't we play our courses? This isn't just a 3D modeling thing, it's a putt-putt course. We wanted to play it. So how do we make a putt-putt course that's playable? We had to figure that out, implement it with the students. Students were wondering what else can we do with our 3D models, right? One really common thing is 3D scanning more and more. So we were able to get a hold of a Kinect camera from the Xbox, scan in the students, and make these uncanny 3D scanned portraits. And then we were able to implement that with our coding to make these interactive portraits as well. Another really common thing with 3D modeling is animation. Students wanted to be able to animate their creations. We had to figure out a way to get that working, and we had never done this before, but we figured it out and we did it. Uh, and of course, the logical consequence from that is we've got our characters wiggling around, acting all strange. We should probably have them all in a dance party, which led to us determining how to get these things all in the same place, also have them moving, and also experimenting with 3D lighting. And the next obvious logical question to ask is, we have this virtual botanical garden, we have this virtual dance party, uh, how can we be inside of them? What if it was VR? And this was another series of problem solving, right? Troubleshooting, and we figured it out and we made these VR environments. So we went all the way from using kind of a pre-made, simple Google Lego product to over the course of a few years of just like enthusiastically and affirmatively responding to students in a dialogic way, making a VR app, which is something that neither of us would have ever guessed we would be doing after a few years of this camp. So we're going to look in a little bit more detail about how we kind of followed those paths. So this was the virtual botanical garden we saw the little kind of postage stamp image of before. After visiting the National Botanical Garden with the students and having them make their own botanical forms, they weren't content with them just sitting separately on their separate computers. So I wound up giving myself a crash course tutorial in Unity, which is a free 3D game design engine. It's now also free for educational use, so you can get it for your school if you need to. And it's a little bit more complex than some of the other tools we've used. It does use a fair bit of coding, but there are numerous tutorials available online from very beginner level to very sophisticated. And I did the very beginner level. I took the very basic first tutorial that's called the rolling ball tutorial, and you're literally just making a box and making a ball that will roll around inside it. And once I did that tutorial, I didn't really go much further than that. I just decided to import the students' different plants that they made into that tutorial and make a garden that you could roll around in to explore and see all the plants, which is why there's that golden ball on the ground. That's a sort of vestige of this basic tutorial that sort of is still at the core of this. So the following year, again, after just following some online tutorials for Unity, I figured out how to make a Unity project VR friendly, how to export it as an app for Android, and then we were able to do really simple, cheap VR experiences just on my phone or on some of the kids' phones with the garden, and make an actual like virtual reality garden that we could visit by putting the garden on the phone, strapping the phone to a kid's head. And this is just an illustration of on the last day of one of the camps when the parents were coming to see the work that the students had been doing. We had a few students who independently wanted to use the Makey Makeys to create a custom control scheme for the virtual botanical garden. So they made those like silvery vines you see hanging from the ceiling, and by interacting with them, you could roll the little ball around and navigate around the space and explore. So this is just an illustration of the sort of like free-form exploration that was happening over the course of our time at the camp. Another project that we did was sorry, an extension of our earlier work with Tinkercad. And this time we drew inspiration from an exhibit at the National Building Museum. It was of putt-putt courses by artists, designers, and architects. And we sort of combined this exhibit with new freely available 3D scanned artifacts that the Smithsonian was putting up on their X3D website. So actual things from the Smithsonian collection are being scanned digitally and available for anybody to download for free, including our students. And we also brought in some inspiration from the Wonder exhibition at the Renwick Gallery. And with all of these sort of inspirations floating around in the Smithsonian air, we wanted to provide a design challenge for the students, which was to create a putt-putt course to be installed on the National Mall, which at the time was undergoing a major renovation. And the challenge was that their course had to incorporate or appropriate some element of the Smithsonian collection. In that first year, it was just a modeling project. So students made their courses, they imported or incorporated something from the Smithsonian collection, and then we took screenshots of them, and that was pretty much it. But of course, students wanted to actually play on theirs and each other's courses. And figuring out how to get this working was a bit more involved. It turned out not to be something I could kind of give myself a crash course in a day and come back the next day knowing how to do. So I kind of put that on hold, and after that first summer, during the school year, I experimented with dropping the students' courses into Unity and rigging up some simple physics to put a ball around. At its core, this still is just that simple rolling ball demo. I just kind of have been Frankensteining other bits of code to it that I've found through different tutorials and things like that. And the first summer back, I kind of took the lead that following summer, and I was bringing the students' models into Unity and kind of getting it all working, and then presenting it to the students the next day to play, which was cool in the sense that they could play their things that they made, but it wasn't terribly student-centered. So for following summers, I created a template and a lesson plan that allowed the students to work in Unity more independently, importing their models and setting up all the interactive elements like the ball and the goal themselves. And yes, that is a student's course where you have to putt a ball through the temple of Abraham Lincoln's death mask. There were a lot of like subversive and playful uses of these historic artifacts, because when it's all digital, you can be irreverent in that way, which was pretty liberating. Another playful extension of our previous projects was animating students' models using a free website called Mixamo. I was actually introduced to Mixamo during my day job teaching high school when one day I heard some music playing in the corner of my computer lab, and I walked over to find a student very proudly beaming at me and pointing at the screen where they had made Shrek twerk to Shakira on her lab computer. And of course, my immediate response was, "Tell me how you did that." And they showed me this site called Mixamo, where you can upload a model that you've made, identify and place the joints on it, and then you can apply several sort of prefab animations to it to see it move around. So initially, we just had them animating within Mixamo, and we found a program called Screen to GIF that lets you just capture parts of the screen and save them as animated GIFs. So the students are making these kind of absurd little dancing models, snapping them into GIFs, and making simple little memes out of them. That falling Garfield was turned into a GIF entitled 100 Most Tragic Anime Deaths. But of course, the students wanted to go further than that, right? So we ultimately ended up importing those models into Unity again, and we figured out how to import the animations as well. So now we could have dancing models in Unity, and by experimenting with some of the lighting available, we were able to make a VR rave app that, again, you could strap to your face in a Google Cardboard headset and explore and be inside. And again, just to reiterate, when we started this camp, neither of us had any experience with 3D modeling, but by responding affirmatively to the students in dialogue, it pushed us in places we'd never have imagined. Uh, Other things that we've done, right, was extending our coding work with the students. This was a response to student interest in commercial digital visioning apps like Snapchat and Instagram, where you can apply filters to your photographs and videos of yourself. These were growing in popularity, and we wanted to respond to the students' interest and invite creative and critical responses. So we extended our earlier, simpler coding work and processing into a project that imported live footage from webcams and then used code to manipulate the imagery. And students were mixing and matching code, bringing in things from previous projects. The image on the left, that the image starts to get distorted and looks like it's catching fire. The way that project works is the louder that you shout at it, the more kind of flaming the image becomes. So they were taking the sound code from that earlier, very simple sound responsive project and applying it to this camera project, building on previous knowledge. Another sort of extension we did was rooted in the fact that one of the very first things students loved doing in Photoshop, kind of across the board, is messing up their face or their classmates' faces using the liquify tool, where you can just grab a part of a face and smear it and smoosh it around. And as we were incorporating more 3D work into the camp, we were looking into how to translate this very playful, intrinsically motivating creative practice to 3D. So we got a hold of a Kinect camera. It's the same camera that comes with the Xbox. You can buy them separately on Amazon or anywhere else that you can get electronics, and you can hook it up to a Windows computer and scan things in 3D with it. I used a free piece of software called K.C to do so. So we scanned in the students as 3D models, and we discovered that these 3D models could be loaded into SculptGL like any other model and manipulated using its clay-like manipulation tools. So these 3D models of the students could be smooshed and squished and inflated and deflated and pulled and pushed. And to kind of frame these explorations, we researched artists who used hyperrealism and distortion of digital bodies to create uncanny and unsettling imagery. We also looked at memes of game glitches, of models of humans that are distorted or falling apart or collapsing in on themselves that have a similar uncanny or unsettling effect. Beyond this initial kind of playful exploration, this also led to a somewhat deeper discussion in the class of the psychology of the uncanny and its relationship to disability and disability discrimination. Why do we respond with fear or with laughter to bodies that are different rather than with sympathy? And this led to a discussion of how in our artwork we need to be sensitive to those sorts of issues as we explore these issues of the body. And then because we can't help ourselves, we decided to do a mashup of these 3D scans and our previous work with processing coding, and we loaded the 3D models into these coded, interactive, psychedelic 3D self-portraits that are very beautiful and very strange.
So I hope you've had a chance to realize that many of our museum connections were not tied to the fine arts. There is so much of art education for young children that is all about teaching those kids how to make art in reaction to existing art. And that's not what artists in the real world are doing. They're making art in reaction to existing life and experiences and history. Um, New media has this permanent presence. It's in our pockets. It's in our faces. It's a part of how we have been changing the dynamics of how we start consuming things, the way that most of my kids don't really watch television or even Netflix anymore. Their choice is watching YouTube. And our goal in dealing with some of these new media ideas was to teach kids how they can interact with and shape digital culture as a producer, not just a consumer, which is what most kids are stuck kind of playing that role. And we, while we had some really good experiences with art museums, something I've noticed in some of the conversations we've had with the 2019 NAEA talks that I've been to is about the way that we uh, almost think about our teaching practices in relation to what students are capable of doing. And I decided just before our talk that at the second you decide for your students what the threshold is of what they are capable of doing is the exact moment that you limit your abilities and your reach as a teacher. That it's your job to open their eyes to the possibilities and not stick with the same thing year after year. Every year for us of the last 5 years has been different. And the last 2 years, Art Tech House had come out. It's a digital arts mashed kind of together with new media museum that is in a converted parking garage in DC. If you get a chance to come by and see it, they have new exhibits almost every 3 months, I think, is their rotation schedule. And when we took our students there, we largely took them for the, what was it called? Where we had the virtual worlds. They had 7 projectors and 260-degree projections of 24-foot walls. And it was all based on, it was fractals. Mm-hmm. It was all based on fractal artwork. This was over this past summer. But they also had these 2 pieces off to the side that used processing cameras or processing software and Connect cameras, very similar to what we had been doing in our classrooms. And it was really interesting to watch middle schoolers. This is that age range of like 11 to 14 years old that were looking at an interactive art made by an adult and were able to, in many cases, correctly hypothesize what type of code and commands were being used to make that happen. That these kids were able to meet the work in acknowledging that they understood not only how it was made, but that they themselves could manipulate it. Now, in thinking about how this is brought back to our classrooms, I primarily teach kindergarten through 6th grade art. And my kindergartners, when we start our first painting project, I'm not terribly concerned about the actual art they're making. I'm working on procedural steps. This is how we use a paintbrush. This is how we mix paint. This is how we take the paintbrush out of the paint or out of into the water cup. And this is how we put things on the drying rack. So I have music playing. The paintings are largely abstract. I have them work on filling in shapes. But we are painting to music, in response of music. And then later, I have them learn how to use the Makeys. We apply copper tape and aluminum foil to our paintings. And then we hook them up to the makeymakey.com piano app. And the paintings that they made to music are now musical instruments that will make music. I've done a lot of the projects in a more diluted way from what we did with our camp, because I only see my kids for about an hour a week. But I have found not only I use the Microsoft Paint now that I've seen how excited kids can get about it. I'm even currently teaching a project right now where I'm using Google Slides as a mild form of PowerPoint to do poster design. But I've found that, these kids aren't experiencing what we think they are. When I was their age, I popped onto my dad's work computer all the time to open up Microsoft Paint. And the type of applications, the whole narrative that we've bought into of digital natives, we're really taking a sense of granted that these kids are able to experience technologies and that they know how to use it, but they don't. And they're not realizing some of these possibilities. So while I've been bringing these things in, the real transition for me of how the digital arts camp has impacted my day-to-day teaching is with changing how I treat student ideas in my classroom. So all children, regardless of their age, love putting their hands in front of a projector so that it casts shadows against the wall. And last year, we got these new projectors where it's not attached to a smart board. There is a interactive camera right below the projector. So no longer is it just cast shadows. If they put their hands close enough to the wall, it will also make these widespread brush marks because it's an interactive board that works in tangent with the projector. And as they were doing this one day, and they have a right to be excited, they're 6 and 7 years old, I very sarcastically said, "Oh, should we just do shadow puppets instead of making art today?" And they almost like whipped around with this response of, "Yes, yes, can we do that? That's so cool." and that was my sign. I personally would have never thought like, "Oh, my first graders want to do shadow puppets." That's their plan. That's what their interest is. But after seeing their excitement, and that was like seeing that they had this desire to do it, we finished up the project we were working on, and then I pulled out those old school dinosaur projectors. I guarantee you, if they're not in your building because somebody has like thrown them out, they are somewhere. They are somewhere in your county. I asked my librarian if I could have one in my steam room, and she was like, "Oh yeah, we've got 20 of those." And then I said, "Oh, can I change this one out because this bulb has like blown out?" And she opens up a cabinet where there were like 45 bulbs. These things exist. Even though it's an old technology, it's still a bright giant projected light. And so we did that, and we took these old cardboard boxes and we made ourselves some simple paper screens. And I taught these kids a little bit about silhouette cutouts and had them working on taping things together. They had to problem solve how to add skewer sticks or control sticks that meant their hands weren't in the shadows. Because on the other side of the screen, I had kids in their class learning how to film the puppeteering that they were making with iPads. And so this idea came solely from that one moment, that one from me, sarcastic moment of should we just do this? And I implore everybody to open up the dialogue that is happening in your classroom. Teach kids that not only are their ideas important and meaningful, but teach them how to pursue the things that intrigue them and embrace that nature.
All right, so I want to talk a bit how I brought things back from the camp into my high school classroom. Um, One of the ways I did this right was taking some of the playful code experimentations that we've been doing in the camp, and I kind of adapted them into a more structured curriculum that suited the more kind of traditionally scheduled public school setting I was teaching in. On the left, you can see a screenshot of the resource that I created. It was an online resource that is available to the public, and it's designed so that not only can my students use it, but anybody can use it to teach the coding units, the creative coding units I've been doing in my classes since sort of experimenting and developing them at the camp. Another way that I've brought things from the camp into my classroom is the physical computing experimentation. Has become kind of an end of year ritual in my digital arts classes at the high school. As we're approaching the end of the year, things are getting a bit like looser and more playful. Uh, we do kind of a experimental physical computing jam where students are challenged to create musical instruments or create alternative game controllers. Some of the more ambitious students also like code their own games to work with their custom controllers. But the idea is that it's the end of the year. We're going to get a chance to work in the physical world and use some of the messy materials that the other art kids have been using and just kind of like experiment, make a mess in the classroom, and generally have fun to like wind down the end of the year. Another, I don't have it pictured here, but thing that I brought back from the camp was incorporating that 3D putt-putt course unit in a way that gave my high school students a bit more access to the code in Unity so that they could play with the variables and the physics of the ball in a way that was a bit more cross-curricular with the things they were doing in their math and physics classes. So you could try and make a putt-putt course that was on the moon and adjust the gravity of the ball and things like that. Uh, Another aspect of teaching in high school, right, is my students are old enough that they're developing kind of a consciousness of their own politics and the politics of the world around them. And politics played a bigger part in the way the critical dimension of these projects played out in this high school setting. The kids took them in different sort of interesting directions. This is one particularly strong example that I found. This student noticed when we were doing the webcam project, right, that the default basic webcam code that just gets a code from the camera and shows it on the screen um, didn't provide much contrast when rendering the faces of dark-skinned students. So if you had a dark complexion, you did not show up particularly well on the camera. So as she was developing her own filter for the system, she was adjusting it to create this kind of like pop art pink kind of style, and she was calibrating it to her own face as she was adjusting the values in the image and things like that. And the end result was that it was calibrated to her complexion. And when we were doing critique and it was tested on me, her white faced teacher, or her white faced classmates, right, our faces were completely blown out and not visible. So she corrected a racist bias that was embedded in the system by its white, probably male coders that was tested largely on white faces, right? And it also was this really radical recentering of the algorithm, right? She recentered it on her face rather than the faces of the traditional coders, and it was a like instructional experience for those of us in the classroom to those of us white people in the classroom, sorry, to interact with a digital system that was not oriented around our bodies, right? That was not made by people like us for people like us. So it was a really like instructive kind of like empathy building experience, which was really incredible.
So we've reached the end. And it was about at this point in our actual talk that the fire alarm had turned off. So if you either had to leave early from this or weren't able to make it at all, perhaps you did not get our pamphlet that is in the NAEA 2019 app. But a few of the things that are on it are a list of the projects that we shared with you here, and some of the additional artists that we used that we didn't talk about. But the most important part of that pamphlet is the back, where we put, I believe, all of the softwares except for a few minor ones that we used within the camp, and some details about, like, if they require a login or if they run ads. And what unfortunately people who did have to leave early missed was we ended up having some great conversations with people in the classroom. So I think before we close this up, a few things I thought we'd mention were, I know that some of the people had come up to me to discuss how we develop digital art programs, like within a school. And the only thing that I can attest to is you try one thing. We started with Microsoft Paint. We started with basic ideas. We don't try to accomplish these wild and great things without just looking at small problems that we're trying to solve along the way and having fun with it. So much of my knowledge base has come from the sheer collaboration and genuine excitement about working with Luke and working with these kids to just see what's possible, no matter how ridiculous it is, taking out kind of the pressure of having something that needs to be aesthetically pleasing and get to focus on just the insanity of taking ideas and mashing them together. But I would encourage, if there was anything in here that interests you, take that one section and try it out. And don't try to accomplish everything at once. We, as art teachers, especially when we're at these conferences, get a chance to see some wildly good people that are very good at this craft of teaching. And it's easy to be intimidated and to have that moment of, I can't do this. But you can. You just can't do it all at once. So I also want to reiterate that if you're at all interested in the processing part, that was where we did the creative code. We taught that through the resources that Luke made off of his website. And I hope that he has a chance to mention that for a quick moment, because I don't think he did.
I mentioned it. It was on an earlier slide.
I don't think he put enough support.
Was there. But in any case, it is there. I can bring it up again. If you want to do coding, there's the link. And like Casey was saying, we had some really incredible discussions with folks afterwards. If you had to leave early and are watching this later and have an incredible discussion you would like to have, you are more than welcome to contact us. My email address is there, lmeeken@gmail.com. KC is mkcosier@gmail.com. And our websites are down below too, with other additional resources and curricular stuff like that. If you have any questions or if you want any materials, we'd love to hear from you. Especially, I'm not teaching high school anymore. I have so many lesson plans that I would love to continue like having a life in other people's classrooms. So just reach out if you have any questions or any interest. Thanks so much for taking the time to come to our talk if you were able to come, and for taking the time to listen to this version of it if you wanted to follow up. It's been great. Thanks.
Bye.